He played defensive end in the National Football League. He stood across the line from some of the biggest men in professional sports and did not back down. But for years, there was one fight he stayed out of on purpose.
He played defensive end in the National Football League. He stood across the line from some of the biggest men in professional sports and didn't back down. But for years, there was one fight he stayed out of on purpose.
Kenyon Coleman, former Dallas Cowboy, now a pastor and coffeehouse owner in Grapevine, Texas, has spent years watching a family he cares about get torn apart in public.
Kenyon Coleman, former Dallas Cowboy, now a pastor and coffeehouse owner in Grapevine, Texas, has spent years watching a family he cares about get torn apart in public. He said nothing. Neither did his wife, Katie. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they were hoping every single day that it wouldn't come to this. It has come to this. Kenyon and Katie Coleman sat down and broke their silence on the record about what they've personally witnessed inside the Daystar conflict, and what they said doesn't match what either side of this story has been telling the public. Before getting into what they said, it helps to understand who's saying it, because that matters here more than almost anywhere else in this story. Kenyon Coleman spent time in the NFL as a defensive end before stepping into ministry. He and his wife Katie now pastor a house church and run a coffeehouse in Grapevine, Texas. That coffeehouse is where they first met Jonathan and Susie Lamb back in 2018, not through Daystar, not through the network's cameras or its stage, but through an ordinary friendship in an ordinary place, one that turned into something much heavier once the Colemans started walking alongside the Lambs through what they describe as years of trying to handle an impossible situation privately, quietly, and with hope for reconciliation, long before any of it became public. Grapevine, Texas isn't a media town. It's not where you'd expect a story with this much reach to actually begin. A coffeehouse counter, a house church meeting in someone's living room instead of a sanctuary seating thousands. That distance from Daystar's own machinery is worth noting. The Colemans were never employees. They were never on the network's payroll. They never depended on Daystar's goodwill for their own ministry's survival. Whatever they said about this conflict, they said it from completely outside the institution's reach, a position very few people close to this story have actually occupied. Here's what makes this moment different from everything that came before it. The Colemans say Jonathan and Susie agonized for years over whether to go public at all, and that going public only happened after every private option had already been exhausted. Even then, their stated hope was never public conflict for its own sake. It was repentance. It was reconciliation within the family. That hope is what kept the Colemans quiet up until the point they gave this interview, even as the public conflict around Daystar intensified. What finally changed, according to the Colemans, was watching how network leadership treated Jonathan and Susie in the period following Joni Lamb's death. They describe what they witnessed as cruelty, severe enough to move two people who'd spent years trying to stay out of the spotlight to finally step into it. Something needs to be addressed directly before going further. Part of the history between the Colemans and the Lambs involves an allegation from several years ago concerning a child in the family. This video is not going to go into detail about that allegation tonight, not the specifics, not the identity of anyone involved, none of it. That's a deliberate choice, not an oversight. The focus here is on what the Colemans witnessed about how adults in positions of power and family authority treated each other, not on relitigating a claim involving a child who deserves privacy regardless of which side of this conflict anyone stands on. If you're looking for those details, you won't find them here, and you won't find them from this channel going forward either. What the Colemans describe in their own words is a pattern of treatment toward Jonathan and Susie that they say doesn't match the language of grace and restoration Daystar broadcasts to millions of homes every day. They describe watching friends they care about get isolated, publicly characterized in ways they believe were unfair, and met with what they call cruelty rather than the reconciliation everyone, including the Colemans themselves, says they hope for. This is where precision matters most, because precision is the whole point of covering something like this responsibly. What the Colemans are describing is their own eyewitness account of how a family and an organization treated two people during a period of real pain. It is not a legal finding. It is not a confession from the other side. It's two named, on-the-record witnesses choosing to speak after years of staying silent about a pattern they say they can no longer avoid describing in good conscience. The Colemans aren't the only perspective that exists here, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be honest coverage. Daystar's leadership and Joni before her passing, offered their own account of this conflict, including allegations against Jonathan directly, which have been covered separately and will continue to be sourced carefully going forward. Two things can be true at once. The Colemans can be sincere, credible, on-the-record witnesses to what they personally saw, and the family they're describing can have its own version of events that deserves to be heard with equal seriousness. This isn't about declaring which entire narrative is correct. It's about noting that two more named people, with real standing and real relationship history, just added their voice to the record, and that matters regardless of which side of this conflict anyone currently believes. There's an objection worth addressing directly, because anyone who's followed this story is probably already thinking it. Of course, the Colemans are defending Jonathan and Susie. They're close friends. Close friends aren't neutral witnesses, and that's a fair point, worth taking seriously rather than waving away. Friendship does shape perspective. It always does, on every side of every story like this. But notice what the Colemans aren't doing. They aren't claiming inside knowledge of Daystar's finances, its board's decisions, or its legal strategy. They're describing what they personally witnessed as friends, in ordinary settings, over years of relationship. That's a narrower and more credible kind of testimony than someone claiming broad institutional knowledge they were never actually positioned to have. Friendship can bias a witness's interpretation of events. It doesn't by itself make their eyewitness account false. The right response to that bias isn't to dismiss what they saw. It's to weigh it honestly alongside every other account. Why does any of this matter beyond one family's private pain? Daystar reaches an enormous global audience, presenting itself as a source of moral and spiritual authority for millions of Christians. When two people with no financial stake in Daystar's business, who spent years actively trying to avoid public conflict, finally decide the private route has failed completely, that decision itself is information. This isn't a single congregation working through an internal dispute behind closed doors. This is a broadcast network reaching homes across the globe, built on a public promise of gospel truth and family values, funded in large part by ordinary viewers who give sacrificially because they trust what they see on their screen. When two witnesses with nothing to gain step forward, specifically because they believe that trust is being violated behind the cameras, that stops being a private family matter. It became a public one the moment Daystar became a public institution asking for public trust, and public trust comes with public accountability attached. Kenyon Coleman doesn't need Daystar's platform. He doesn't need this story to build his own following. That's precisely why his willingness to step forward after years of staying quiet carries a different kind of weight than testimony from someone with something to gain from speaking. There's something worth sitting with in the shape of his own story too, separate from what he said about Daystar. A career built on a stage that size, in a league that visible, followed by a deliberate choice to step into something as small and unglamorous as a house church and a neighborhood coffee house. That's not the trajectory of someone chasing platform or influence.
It is closer to the opposite. People who spend years building a quieter, smaller kind of ministry out of the spotlight tend to think differently about when speaking publicly is actually worth the cost.
It's closer to the opposite. People who spend years building a quieter, smaller kind of ministry out of the spotlight tend to think differently about when speaking publicly is actually worth the cost.
Precisely because they are not used to seeking that spotlight in the first place. That context does not make Kenyon and Katie Coleman infallible witnesses. Nobody is.
Precisely because they aren't used to seeking that spotlight in the first place. None of that makes Kenyon and Katie Coleman infallible witnesses. Nobody is. But it's worth knowing who's telling you something, not just what they're telling you. And this is a couple who spent years choosing smallness before they ever chose to speak. There's a verse worth sitting with here, from Luke chapter 12. Nothing is covered that won't be revealed. Nothing hidden that won't be made known. That's not a threat, it's a promise, and it applies equally to every person in this story, on every side of it. Hidden things surface eventually, whether the person hiding them wants that or not. Sometimes that surfacing comes through a lawsuit, sometimes through a document, and sometimes, like tonight, it comes through ordinary people who spent years hoping they'd never have to speak publicly at all, finally deciding their silence was doing more harm than their words ever could. Consider what silence actually costs in a story story like this. For years, the Colemans chose it, hoping it would give room for private reconciliation to happen. That's not weakness. In a culture that often rewards the loudest voice in any conflict, choosing quiet, patient hope over public conflict is its own kind of discipline. But that same verse from Luke reminds us, silence isn't a permanent shelter. At some point, what's hidden becomes known one way or another, and the question every witness in a story like this eventually has to answer is whether they'll be the ones to reveal it on their own terms, with care and precision, or whether it'll surface some other way, without either. This story will keep being covered the way it always has been, named sources, on-the-record accounts, both sides represented, even when that makes it harder to tell cleanly. Tonight, 2 more names joined that record, and neither of them had anything to gain by doing it. That alone should say something about why they finally did. There's no way to know how this particular chapter ends, whether the reconciliation the Colemans say Jonathan and Susie have hoped for all along will ever happen, or whether this family's rift is now permanent in a way no amount of hoping can undo. What is known is that 2 more people who spent years choosing silence over spectacle have now gone on the record, and a story built entirely on named, on-the-record witnesses is a stronger, more honest story than one built on anonymous claims from either direction. That's the standard this coverage holds itself to, every episode, and tonight was no exception. If you want every story to be presented with integrity, then stay connected with The Celebrity Vault. Please like and share the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. May God shower His blessings upon you. God loves you. God smiles when He sees you.